Hello, it's an absolute delight to talk to you today. I'd like to start by thanking the ISBW Organising Committee for inviting me here. When City sent me that email last year, I just was ecstatic. I have reached peak seagrass, right? And then it was a quick fall to earth after that. I went for a walk on Palaranda Beach, just north of Townsville, with my husband, who, for some context, is a coral reef ecologist. And we were walking along and the tide was out, and I very smartly pointed to the ground and said, "That is seagrass, Tom." You know? I am a plenary speaker at the World Seagrass Conference, and he turned to me and asked, "What species of seagrass is that, Alana?" Now, this was pre-seagrass spotter days. And I turned to him and said, "It's a holophila." "What species of holophila is that, Alana?" Well, I will never have that problem again. On the weekend, I downloaded Seagrass Spotter, and I'll make sure to take that out with me every weekend since. Another confession I have to make is that the top heading of this talk is very ambitious, so I apologise for that. But I will be talking primarily about seagrasses and how we manage their anthropogenic impacts into the future as well. And so how do I flip to the next?
Logistics team, where is our clicker?
That would help. Okay, right, so I can't go over there and click? Okay, there's a few clicks. Okay, it's 45 minutes. Can you click back? Okay, and click to the next. And so what I'll do is I'll just go like this every time I need you to click. Like I'll click when you click, okay? Thank you very much. All right, wish me luck. Okay, so a lot of you will probably be familiar with this map. It's the Cumulative Human Impact Map developed by Benjamin Halpern. It looks at, basically what he does and his unit does is map out all the different anthropogenic activities that occur in the marine and coastal environment. He then has compared it with a distribution of about 20 marine and coastal habitats, including seagrasses. And from that, he's able to estimate sort of cumulative human impact in the marine environment. And this particular paper is a follow-up to a paper he published in 2008 in Science, which also did the same mapping. And the really neat thing about doing this kind of process is you can map out temporal change in cumulative impacts. And what you can see here really is that it's this tropics area and along the coast where we see the greatest change in cumulative human impact. These areas in 2008 and again in 2013 are the most exposed to cumulative impacts, and that impact is increasing into the future as well. So if we now look at the tropics here, sorry, back one, thank you. So the tropics is the fastest growing region in regards to human population, and also human population within this region is moving closer to the coastline and using more coastal resources. And I think the Minister put it really well this morning. We're getting this increased intensity of use around our coastal environments where seagrasses are. So, you know, what does that mean for seagrasses into the future? Okay, so tropical seagrasses have the greatest species diversity than any other sort of region on the planet. And these seagrass species perform multiple ecosystem services, as described really well in these latest review papers here. But one of my favourite ecosystem services that seagrasses provide is that they, and this was published last year by Jolie Lamb, who was a student in our centre, a PhD student with her Indonesian colleagues. She found that seagrass is so fantastic that it actually cleans bacteria from human poop. So how good is that, right? Coral reefs don't do that, but seagrasses do that. It's not a competition. And I think what is driving a lot of our research questions in our World Seagrass community is how do cumulative impacts affect tropical seagrass species? But more importantly, I think what is driving us is how do we support seagrasses to recover, to replenish, recruit and recover in the Anthropocene, because we've not only locked in climate change, we have locked in human impact as well from other pressures. And so that's what really drives a lot of my research. Okay, works, great. Okay, so I live in Townsville, which is in the centre of the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, as you can see here on the map. And Townsville is known for three things. It is known for having a world-class university in marine science. It has a beautiful magnetic island off the coast, and it was the host of this conference in 2004. Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's also home to one of the largest seagrass habitats in the world. It contains about 40,000 kilometres squared of seagrass, both shallow, intertidal, subtidal and deep. You can see it extends all around, all down the coastline. I believe about 20% of the world's seagrass species are captured in this region. And in the next few slides, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the human impacts to seagrasses in this particular location. But I'd like to point out that it's always very humbling when I come to Southeast Asia, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of scientists as well from my region, in that, you know, we see that the challenges here as an environmental scientist managing all of the various human impacts at places like Singapore. You know, I look outside my window and I, you know, see a huge, massive port, the world's largest in regards to thoroughfare of boats, and it just must be a very daunting task to manage seagrass in this region. And I am very honoured to be able to share some of my knowledge, and I hope that some of the processes and models that I develop are able to somehow inform our research and conservation in these regions, right? But I do also appreciate that when you look at Ben Halpin's map, Australia is blue, right? We are low risk relative to places like Southeast Asia. Okay, so I just needed to put that out there. Oh yeah, and dugongs are also living in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, which is another study species close to my heart. And it was delightful to see Donna Kwan here as well. So there's four main industries in Queensland, which is the state adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area, and they are mining, agriculture, construction, building houses, and tourism. So in the last few years, there's been an increase in global demand for minerals as well as coal, metallurgical coal, from the Great Barrier Reef catchment and further down into Queensland as well. This growth has somewhat tapered off, but you know, it's hard to predict what's going to happen into the future in some cases. This growth in the minerals and mining sector has in turn created greater demand for the use of ports and also shipping lanes in the Great Barrier Reef. To give you some context, about 80% of the world's metallurgical coal that is moved by ships goes through the Great Barrier Reef, right? It comes from this particular area, and the global demand for that particular resource isn't going to diminish. About 4,000 ships move into ports in Townsville and Cairns and Gladstone and Hay Point each year, and that's predicted to grow into the future. There's also regional centres such as Cairns, Townsville and Gladstone, which also exert pressures on the coastal marine environment. There's dredging that occurs in ports. There's changes to water movement as a result of coastal developments as well. But really, the spatial footprint of mining activities is quite minor. Indeed, the spatial footprint of coastal constructions is quite minor relative to agriculture. About 80% of the Great Barrier Reef catchment is covered by agricultural activities, including grazing and sugarcane, and there is a lot of movement and a lot of push by the federal government to potentially expand those activities into the very remote northern areas of the Great Barrier Reef, which could really change water quality in that particular location. So at the moment, most of the poor water quality driven by the agricultural sectors occurs along the coast in the southern Great Barrier Reef, Cairns south. This region as well is very well known for its cyclones. Between where I live in Townsville and where my colleagues live in Cairns, it's called Cyclone Alley, just simply because of the number of cyclones that come through that area. And those cyclones exert extreme power and force onto our coastal environments and rip up seagrass beds in the process. We're also undergoing climate change as shown so visually in the recent back-to-back bleaching events, right? So, this is a fast-moving space in regards to climate change as well. About 66% of the marine park is open to fishing activities such as trawling and netting. And fishing activities, as well as other impacts as well, are managed by a really complex system of governance. So this is an example here of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, managed by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And it's, gold standard for marine management, but it actually is one of multiple policy and regulatory levers used by government, right? So the Great Barrier Reef is actually what you'd consider to be a polycentric system of governance. It's my social science word for the day, right? So that means that there's multiple players that operate in this particular location. And that can be a good thing because it means that no one organisation holds all the power, right? And we have all these checks and balances in the system, but it also can mean that environmental management is really slow, right? And there's lots of players and it just takes a really long time. So in this sort of space, how do we start to examine what the cumulative human impact of all of these interacting pressures are on seagrass? And so some early work I did, which I presented at the 2010 conference in Thailand with Rob Coles was attempting to do that. And so we looked at coastal seagrasses and we used a similar method to Halpin where we mapped out all the pressures to seagrass, and then we used a vulnerability assessment to measure the relative impact of those pressures and then compared it with a map of seagrass distribution, right, to figure out what are these areas that are most exposed to human cumulative impact. And I took this model and our work to a briefing of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority in 2012 when they were really interested in looking at the impacts of ports and shipping. And I pointed out the area of Townsville and Abbott Point and looked at explained risk and how you go about these processes. And a senior manager at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority asked me, well, if we lose all of the seagrasses in Townsville, what does that mean for the broader ecosystem? And that was a good question, and I didn't have an answer for it. And it's a good question because when you're a manager and you're thinking about impact, you must not just think about what is happening at that site. You must think about the implications for, well, if we lose this particular meadow, what does that mean for connected meadows? And this is really important in the context of environmental offsets. And in potentially really connected areas like the Great Barrier Reef, they must be thinking like that. So he presented me with this problem, and 6 years later I'm presenting him with the solution. That's how long science takes. And so what do we know about seagrass connectivity in the Great Barrier Reef region? And indeed for a lot of tropical seagrass communities. Well, we all know that seagrasses are clonal flowering plants, and most of the research that's been conducted on them is on those clonal reproductive processes. But we know that seagrasses have evolved for long-distance dispersal, and that's because they invest quite a significant amount of energy in sexual reproduction, and they also have floating fragments, seeds, and flowers as well. And based upon genetic data, we know that seagrass population structure is not always dominated by these clonal processes, right? So we must be getting propagules in from somewhere. And there is physical evidence of really, sometimes often fast recruitment and recovery after disturbance events, after quite severe disturbance events. So this makes us infer that connectivity is contributing to seagrass resilience in the tropics by enabling these habitats to bounce back after very large disturbance events like cyclones or the loss from low light and so on. But in the Great Barrier Reef region where we work, we don't understand what the spatial patterns or the scale of that connectivity is. Is it, are meadows only connected to adjacent meadows, or are they connected more broadly? We don't understand what the dispersal pathways are, and we have no idea where the critical source meadows are. We can guess, but we actually don't even know if that's something that exists. So really that's what's driving our research at the moment, and in this next few slides I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some recent work that we've done where we've modelled the dispersal of seagrass propagules using a hydrodynamic model, and then we've used a network analysis to understand connectivity. And then the really fun part from my perspective is we started messing with those connectivity networks to see, well, how do cumulative human impacts affect connectivity of seagrasses, in an attempt to answer that senior manager's question 6 years ago. He's retired now, by the way. So before I go on, I really want to point out that projects like this require a fantastic team, and I have the best team for this kind of thing, right? So I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues at Tropwater, especially Rob Coles at the University of Adelaide, Michelle, and also I work with a great team of numerical modellers based at the University Catholique de Louvain who developed this fantastic model SLIM that we use, and a great bunch of people to work with. So science can be fun as well as informative too. So the way that we simulate the dispersal of seagrass is by using the two-dimensional SLIM model developed originally in Belgium. It was first initiated in the Great Barrier Reef in 2008 by Jonathan Lambrix. It's been calibrated for the Great Barrier Reef, and we've been using it to model the dispersal of other species such as turtles, not as good as dugongs, but we model it for turtles too, as well as fish and coral larvae as well. And the really unique thing about this particular hydrodynamic model is it uses unstructured grids of variable resolution, and this is really handy for modelling dispersal in very complex coastal and reef environments, because you can have quite small elements that pick up a lot of variability around very complex coastlines, and in very heterogeneous areas you can have quite large elements, right? And we use it, and it's informed by real data on wind speed, directions and tides, and for this particular case study we used data between 2012 and 2013. And then what we used was what's called a Langrarian particle tracker, which enables us to track the dispersal of these virtual seagrass propagules in our modelling domain. And we chose the Central Great Barrier Reef as our case study because we've got really good seagrass data there, thank you to our colleagues at Tropwater, and there was a really good SLIM was sort of nicely calibrated for this particular location. And in this particular location there's about over 100 discrete seagrass meadows of varying sizes, and we broke these seagrass meadows up into whether they were foundation species and non-foundation species, and all analyses was conducted separately on those two different species types. So we ran simulations, about 68 different simulations over the entire reproductive period to capture all the potential variability in tides and winds and water currents. And then we also looked at whether there were differences in particles or propagules, virtual propagules that were floating at the surface or floating below the surface. And when they were at the surface we used a 2% wind drag coefficient, and below the surface we didn't have a wind drag coefficient. And so for each of the 68 simulations, we released about 150,000 particles. And in total, so at the end of it, we had 10 million particles to play with in our analyses. We released these particles from 317 sites. And the reason why I'm just pointing this out is because I've got 45 minutes and so I can talk science, which is nice for a change compared to a 12-minute conversation. But in the deep water areas we have quite large distances between those release sites so that our analyses isn't swamped by deep water habitats who are probably not as reproductive as the shallow coastal water areas. And then the simulation length for each of our simulations was 8 weeks, and thanks to Paul Erftemeyer we were able to use a very good decay function associated with that as well, so that particles released closer to the release date stopped quicker. So about halfway through the 8 weeks most particles had dropped out, right, to reflect what potentially is happening in real life. And so we have here, those are two animations, but I don't think I can click on them. That's all right. So the two graphs on the side show the release locations of Cleveland Bay, and if I had a helper they could come up and press the play button, but that's okay. I can just talk to you about what happens is they disperse, and at the time, thank you City, And the top one is for particles that are floating at the surface, and the bottom one is for particles floating below the surface. And when it starts going, all you have to do is just click on them both, and they should start playing. And so and these were released in August 1st, 2012, and so you can see that they're moving in that southeast direction, and the reason why they move in that southeast direction is because at this time we have these strong southeast trade winds, and if you are released and you're floating at the surface, you go much further, obviously, than if you are below the surface. And on average, if you were floating at the surface, you went about 60 kilometres, and below the surface about 34 kilometres. But there were particles that went almost 1,000 kilometres as well, right? So we're seeing this potential for really long distance dispersal, but predominantly they were within 40, 60 kilometres from the natal seagrass meadows. We also used a linear mixed effect model to look at, well, what are the physical features driving this dispersal, right? And what we found was that, and this all kind of makes sense when you think about it, the further you are away from the coast, the more exposed you are to wind and wave energy, the further you're going to go. Also, depending upon the time of month you're released, if you're released in a really windy month, you're going to go further. And what I really like about this particular analysis is that, we're coming up with some decision rules here, right, which hopefully can be applied in other areas which don't have amazing models like SLIM to work with, and amazing groups of people to work with too. And so we ended up with all of these dispersal clouds as shown here, 10,000 particles, and we imported it into GIS, and we used that to populate a connectivity matrix which tells us how many propagules are moving from meadow X and meadow Y. And so a lot of our 10 million particles dropped out then because a lot of them didn't land on top of another meadow. But at this particular time, I'd like to point out that, life gets in the way, and between this particular project and the next project I'm talking to you about, I believe I quit a job, moved interstate, got a new job and had a baby. So that's life, right? That's the life of a scientist, an actual living scientist. And so these are the two networks that were created based upon our connectivity matrices. We have a network for non-foundation species and a network for the foundation species. So each point represents a discrete meadow. The lines or edges connecting those nodes are functional connections, so that means that propagules move from one to the other or vice versa. These are directed networks, so they're meant to have arrows on it, but I removed them because you couldn't see them very well. The lines perpendicular to nodes also indicate self-replenishment, and there was quite a lot of variability in self-replenishment in these particular networks. The location of the networks is also of the nodes is also important. So if you're a node and you're physically far away from another node, as you can see here in the network, that means you're less connected to it than you are to those that are closer to you. And the colour is also important because the colour indicates modularity or community. So if you're the same colour, you are more connected to that meadow than you are to other meadows, right? So we're starting to sort of get some understanding of communities here. The size is also important because the size indicates the network measure between the centrality, and nodes or meadows which have a high betweenness centrality can be important stepping stones, right? That they connect different parts of the network together and they help maintain overall connectivity. And these, just by looking at these networks, we're beginning to realise they are very similar to what we call small world networks. Small world networks are very densely connected. As these meadows are, there is only one component in each of these networks. That means that everything is effectively somewhat connected to each other, and it doesn't take very many steps to get from one end of the network to the other. And small world networks are actually quite resilient to the random loss of nodes, and that's because there's a lot of these redundant connections. And to show you these networks spatially, as we see them in the Great Barrier Reef, you can see the nodes and the edges connecting those nodes here. And once again, we have those different communities represented by the circles here. There is a directional aspect to this connectivity, and that directional aspect follows those southeast trades winds, as I talked to you about previously. But the interesting thing as well in these non-foundation species is that the offshore, the deep water meadows are actually also connected to the inshore meadows and are resupplying, and there is also some movement out as well. So we have this different directional movement too. So a couple of things to note here is that we have found, some really important source meadows, right? That are supplying a lot of propagules to the network, and they are down here around Upstart Bay and in Cleveland Bay, and there's another one down here in the Whitsundays as well. So they're supplying quite a lot of propagules to the system. The deep water habitats too, right, are also supplying quite a lot of propagules to the system. Interesting thing about Upstart Bay, which is just here, which has a really low between us centrality, this meadow is actually really large, right? But it's primarily self-seeding. So 98% of the propagules, or the virtual propagules, they're not real propagules, Alana, that land on Upstart Bay come from Upstart Bay, right? And that means this habitat, and there's another habitat similar to that down in the Whitsundays, is, quite self-persistent. But that could be problematic from a management perspective, because if something takes that meadow away, it could be really quite slow to recover because it is not as well connected to other meadows. And so we know that these are small world networks. We know that they're really densely connected, so that means that they're less vulnerable to these random loss of nodes. But we wanted to test that, right? We really wanted to see, well, if we start removing some of these meadows, what does that mean for connectivity in the central Great Barrier Reef? And so we took 6 real world impacts, and they were Cyclone Hamish, Cyclone Yassi, the City of Port of Townsville, which is just here, flooding of the Burdekin River, and the Port of Abbott Point, and down here is Cyclone Debbie, a recent cyclone event. And we assume that if a meadow was on top of or adjacent to these impacts, that it was completely destroyed. And then we effectively used a sensitivity analysis and 64 different scenarios of all combinations of these cumulative impacts to see, well, what human impact had the greatest impact on connectivity in this particular region. And what we found for foundation species, which is quite interesting, that these meadows here in the middle at Cleveland Bay, if you lost those meadows, they had a greater impact on connectivity than if you lost all the meadows here and here, right? And that's kind of funny when you think about it, because, well, that's quite a loss of meadows, right? But this meadow here is really important for connectivity because it is that stepping stone south and north, right? When we attempted to do the same kind of analysis for the foundation species, it didn't work, right? Because we only have quite a few nodes in there, and as soon as we start taking away nodes, it starts messing up our network measures. But what we did do was take away all the nodes that are adjacent or on top of these particular pressures, and we looked at our network and we realised it's still connected. It's still one component. How many nodes do we have to take away, how many meadows, before we can break connectivity in the central GBR? Or indeed, how big does an impact have to be in scale to break these networks down? And so we tried that. So what we did was, for every single meadow, we removed other meadows at varying distances and then recalculate our connectivity measures to look at how long the distance or diameter needs to be of an impact event before we break these networks into 2 components. And it was quite large. So for foundation species, it was about 290 kilometres on average, and for non-foundation species, it was about 246 kilometres on average. And to give you some context, the very severe winds of Tropical Cyclone Yassi were 150 kilometres. So, it's going to take a really big impact event to split connectivity in this region. So to go back to the original question posed to me by the manager at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, what does losing seagrass at one location mean for other locations? Well, it's complicated. As a scientist, we're obliged to say it's really complicated. But I think what we've done in this process, at least identify, a few key hotspots, as well as broaden our understanding that you need to not only look at what's happening at a habitat, but perhaps more what's happening at also its community level, as well as the metapopulation level, which we believe we've also identified in our modelling approach. So what we can certainly say to reef managers is that these networks are really densely connected, which makes seagrasses, from the connectivity perspective of resilience, quite robust to disturbance events. And this is supported by some evidence, because we're getting, in some areas like Cleveland Bay, which I was pointing out earlier, just adjacent to where I live in Townsville, there's records of quite fast recovery after following a disturbance event, especially around 2011, 2012, when we had a lot of seagrass dieback in that area. It's come back, and it's come back with a vengeance. But what about these isolated meadows like Upstart Bay and some of the meadows in the Whitsundays? What does it mean? What does this sort of research mean for them? Well, you know, so, got a drink. So the meadows aren't absolutely isolated, and more than that, some work that's come from Samantha Toll and my colleagues at Trop Water has shown that turtles and dugongs are actually quite good at moving seeds around the Great Barrier Reef, and only the way that they know how. And this supports connectivity in multiple ways, in that it can move seeds and viable seeds into areas like Upstart Bay and the Whitsundays, which are less connected than other areas. But we're also getting this multi-directional connectivity, right? They can move things south when primarily our connectivity is heading in a northwest direction. But what we really believe is happening here is that we have a situation where we have a very large potential supply of propagules, and propagules are moving around a lot in this particular region. And so really, from a management perspective, the best thing that you can do to support recovery, replenishment and recovery of seagrasses in this place is to manage for the human impacts that affect settlement and recruitment. So this means managing for poor water quality, sedimentation and so on. So it means fixing up the catchments, be careful with your dredging, watch your boat scars and so on. And in the words of Rob Coles here, I'm putting you in this, if it's good enough for restoration, it's going to be good enough for recruitment, because we have this huge potential supply of propagules in the region. But is this the case for all seagrass habitats in the tropics? Some of our new research coming out of the Torres Strait is indicating that that's perhaps not the case. So the Torres Strait is between mainland Australia and Papua New Guinea. As you can see on the little map down there, it contains Australia's largest continuous seagrass bed, as you can see here. It is the dugong capital of the world, and those seagrasses perform also other multiple ecosystem services of value to the community in that region. So we use the same approach. This is very early research, by the way, using the SLIM model to model the dispersal of seagrass propagules in that region. And very early on in the season, you have this east-west movement because of the winds, but for most of the reproductive period for seagrasses in the Torres Strait, you actually get an east-west flow and a west-east flow. It actually kind of all just stays in the Torres Strait. All the waters kind of just swish back and forth, and so do the propagules as well. And they're primarily staying at least on or near their natal seagrass meadows. So we don't think connectivity is such an important feature of resilience of these particular seagrass species in Torres Strait. But then at the same time, our modelling domain is restricted to the Torres Strait. And what we really need to do is extend our modelling domain down to other regions, and that's something that we're doing in the future. So a couple of weeks ago, my colleagues came over from Belgium, and we're now working on expanding these hydrodynamic models to the entire northeast coast of Australia, so that we can conduct our analyses at that particular scale. And that would be really cool as well, because then we can start identifying potentially these meta populations or management units where seagrasses are highly connected within there. And what's also important is we need to increase the temporal resolution of these models So in both cases, we only use one season, but the reality is that each season brings with it its own unique conditions that operate at much broader timescales than what we're dealing with. And that's something that, is best practice and that we need to do into the future. And what also I'd really like to look at as well is whether mangroves especially have the same kind of physical locations of areas of high outflux, right, areas which are really important, or areas of high betweenus centrality, so that we can help inform whether we've got these hotspot habitats or for sort of to enable managements to think sort of about multi-species protection. But more importantly, we need to really validate these models with empirical studies, and that's important. So not only validating the models based upon dispersal, but also ensuring that the areas that we're predicting to be really important as source reefs or as source meadows or stepping stone meadows are also have the capacity to generate or are productive enough that they're actually fulfilling their function as we hope they are, right? And so to end with, I'd just like to bring us back to this theme of translating science into action. It's something that I've learned very early on is we really need to have these interdisciplinary teams of scientists and managers working together to develop our research questions, to inform our research questions, as well as to implement our research. I couldn't do this kind of work without a team of seagrass ecologists, geneticists, numerical modellers, spatial analysts, social scientists, governance experts, policy experts. That's really the future of research. In fact, it's the present of research, right? But that being the case, there is a very big temporal mismatch between the information that managers need to do their job and the speed at which scientists can deliver it. Like, as I said before, the inception for this project in 2012 was by a senior manager in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority who is now retired, and indeed at that time the biggest focus for them was on ports and shipping accidents. And now that's completely changed. After back-to-back bleaching, all of conservation capital has been taken away from a lot of our coastal resources in the Great Barrier Reef region to focus on coral reefs. And, when you're dealing with a government agency who's got a limited amount of staff and a limited amount of funding, you can't blame them for prioritising this kind of event, right? But it's also really important that we stay in it for the long haul, right? And keep doing the research that we're doing in the hope that one day priorities might change and they might come back to talk to us about this. That's the hope. Thank you very much. I'll take some questions. Very good. Oh, sorry.
There's a microphone coming around.
My question is, you've got the potential recruitment rates in your dispersal model, but is there any available information to actually give you, the actual vital rates of recruitment in this area? So in other words, even though propagules can move in your network, which ones are actually supplying recruits into these populations that become then reproductive adults? Is there any way of building that in this model, or is it still just going to look at potential dispersal?
Yes, you can. So, we looked, so you can incorporate behaviour effectively in your particles. And behaviour can include, the wind drag coefficient when it's floating or underneath the surface. If it's efficient, it can include swim behaviours, but you can also include death rates and other measures as well. So perhaps that's something that we can explore to incorporate that information in there too, but it's absolutely possible.
Any other questions? We have roving mics, so just put up your hand while you're line.
Hi, Alana. Thank you for a beautiful question, for your beautiful presentation. You talked about the impacts of large herbivores on the dispersal of seeds, so they can facilitate dispersal. But large herbivores are at some locations also changing in densities, and they have a large impact on seagrass meadows. And in areas where I work, we see that the seeds or seagrasses aren't producing any seeds anymore because they are so overgrazed. I don't know what the situation is in the Great Barrier Reef, but can you think of possible impacts of this grazing on dispersal of seagrasses in a larger scale in the Great Barrier Reef too?
Well, I think that could certainly be the case after a large disturbance event, and you have very limited seagrass habitat and still quite a lot of animals feeding on it, and the implications for that. There's probably not, so that certainly would occur in the Great Barrier Reef and areas of the Torres Strait Gulf of Carpentaria as well. But in this particular location, it's probably not so much of an issue as, whereabouts do you work?
This was, for example, in Indonesia and some areas of the Caribbean.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So probably not so much of an issue here. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Peter Ralph had a question. Nicole up there. Oh, sorry. After that.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, hi Peter. Yep. Quick question is, with your model, you're predicting the distribution of the seeds into established meadows. Can your model predict the seeds going into potential new habitats to establish new meadows?
Absolutely. So of the 10 million particles that we released, only I think 10 or 15% actually fell on other meadows. So we have all of this other data that we can use to explore that. And that's actually a really interesting question.
So how do you then do water quality, depth of meadows, sediment types? So have you got GISs to address a fertile place that it could establish?
Well, yes, we assume that where seagrass has been mapped before is a discrete meadow, and is where and if our propagules landed on that, that's where we created a functional connection within our connectivity matrix.
Okay. Exciting.
Alana, Rob, hi. Thanks, great talk, terrific topic, really enjoyed it. Something got me thinking there when you showed the width of, the width of the band that would need to be perpetrated on seagrass to really have a very negative effect. And in fact, the cyclones were narrower than that. And then I was thinking, well, at first I thought, yeah, well, that's natural. I mean, they've had thousands of years to be ready for cyclones, and if they weren't resilient, if you like, to that, then they wouldn't be there. But there has been a change in the last 50 to 100 years where all these other impacts, particularly the rivers flowing deep with sediment now, are impacting especially along the shallow water ones. So that led me to thinking about interacting stresses, and in a way as you said, you'd like to model over the longer term, 20 years and so on, and then I'm sure in your, where you live in the world, there's a lot of thought about predicting climate change impacts. So how do you see the famous interacting stresses playing out overlaid on your current connectivity modelling?
Playing out into the future? Well, it's inevitable that we're going to get reductions in connectivity over time in this particular location, and that in turn could have effect on some productivity, which sort of we end up in this sort of cycle of impact, I would say. But as long as, I guess, you still have some meadows, simply because in this Great Barrier Reef region, the way that the winds work and the way that the currents work, it is enabling these sort of long-distance dispersal events. With some meadows, there's potential for recovery into the future, just as long as we don't break out very large blocks of land, large blocks of the sea for these effects. Yeah, so I always think about scale, spatial scale.
Michelle? It's really exciting to see the modelling get to this stage, and having worked with you on some of it, it's the challenges are how to actually get, as Gary alluded to the information we do have, as opposed to the assumptions we made. And I know in the most recent work, we split things into the foundational and the non-foundational, but that means we're aggregating propagules of different types of species. So obviously, one of the next stages will be to have species-specific models. But what's really interesting is, in a general sense, the genetic data over the larger scale that we've been slowly collecting matches what your model's telling us. So it's not surprising that we... the broader scale of populations. But we haven't started doing that very fine-scale testing of genetic movement within your 250 kilometre range yet, because we wanted to know what that larger scale was. But within that 250 kilometre range, the real challenge for management is to prevent barriers to connectivity. So this is all predicated on maintaining connectivity that you use in the hydrodynamic model. So what would you recommend to managers around, you know, that maintenance of hydrodynamic, hydrological connectivity as the underlying assumption of how this work can be applied?
Thank you very much, Michelle. I was asked the same question by a member of the Department of Energy and Environment the other day, so I'm prepped. It's really just looking at the dispersal patterns here and looking at the way that seagrasses are distributed in this particular location. It would take quite a large barrier to stop this water movement, right? So at fine spatial scales, like within a bay, like Townsville, putting extra rock walls or jetties out and so on will have some effect on the way that water moves and connectivity, but it would actually be really quite difficult to put in a barrier, a physical barrier like that, I think. Yeah. Yeah, just because the scales are so big. And especially you've got those deep water habitats too for the non-foundation species. Yeah, that are bringing it in, so you couldn't like put a barrier out there either. Yeah.
That would be really interesting to test whether that's
An actual real thing. Yeah. Because we were quite surprised about it. We assumed that all those propagules would just head straight southeast, but I mean, when we're running these kind of models as well, we must look at sort of probability, and for those deep water models, most of the virtual propagules did move northwest, but it only takes a few, right, to start making those connections into the networks.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I want to give you a hypothetical, which perhaps you already have data that you can discuss on the foundation centers. If they are already impacted by something like sedimentation from agriculture or port dredging and filling, and then a level 5 typhoon or other equivalent, like a tsunami, something comes. Is that possible then to disrupt it to the point where it no longer has connectivity?
It really depends upon where it's situated relative to other meadows within its meadow population. So in this case, if that happens to you as a meadow, but you've got quite a few meadows south of you which are not exposed to human impact, they have the potential to replenish you once your habitat condition is in the right state, that you can be adequately replenished and have recruitment.
It just seems to me it's another reason.
Sorry, Anita, we are running out of time. We have one last question from Catherine McMahon, and then I think we
I'll be here all week.
Catherine?
Thanks, Sidi. Wonderful talk, Alana. I really enjoyed it. I had a question similar to Michelle about whether there was a match between the biology, so the genetic connectivity, and it was exciting to hear that there is.
Yeah,
but in your models, you obviously simulate the release of particles, and you measure that connectivity, and there's sites that have really high betweenness. Can you do some kind of back calculation to work out how many particles would need to be released from a meadow to maintain that connectivity? Because I think we don't really have a great sense of that at the moment.
I haven't had a coffee yet, Kath.
Sorry, maybe we can talk about it at lunch.
We might have to talk about that one at lunch. So, you know, there's what I really love about this particular type of modelling is just the plethora of data, right, and the amount that you can fiddle with it. And I've just shown you, like, just a very small product of what you can get from this kind of analyses. And so I kind of think I know what you're asking, and I kind of think that we could potentially give it a shot, but I'm going to need another coffee, before I take you further on
Or
that.
maybe a wine tonight.
I'm sure that can be arranged. Okay, thank you, Alana, and I'd like you all to join me in thanking Alana for that wonderful plenary. Great way to kick off this conference.